Hello everyone. So as Rafa said, my name is Erin. I've been working at the CCI now since the end of October. My background comes from volume electron microscopy. And if anyone has ever touched anything upon that line, you know that these experiments with this type of technology can last for days on end with the machine running 24/7. So being able to access the machine remotely, being able to do kind of just checking and any form of remote control is necessary for these types of long time imaging experiments. So that's what I'm currently have done in the past with a couple of other different softwares that I'm using now. So I'll be primarily focusing on what we're using now in the CCI, but I will obviously mention that there are a couple of other programs that can be used. So to begin with, the three main pieces of software or the options that I've used to access electron microscopes in the past have been TeamViewer. I've used a remote desktop connection a couple of times and currently now using NoMachine. If anyone at all has had any other software experience with any other pieces of software, then more than welcome to mention or give other examples, because I think trying out a variety of softwares will kind of give an idea of potentially what is the best way to control these machines or even just monitoring the experiments. So I used TeamViewer when I was doing my PhD at Newcastle University at the Electron Microscopy Research Services there, and it is still currently being used there to be monitoring these serial block-based scanning electron microscopy, the volume electron microscopy experiments. So as you can see here, you can both use the SmartSEM, which is controlling the microscope, as well as the image analysis, the imaging program that is kind of allowing you to dictate where your regions of interest are, how you're imaging, your resolution, and sort of you can monitor your experiment through that, but then monitor the controls of the microscope through a secondary program, which is common for most volume electron microscopy scanning electron microscopes, especially the ones with Zeiss. So now specifically in the CCI, we are primarily using NoMachine. So this program, I only learned about it like a couple of months ago. And similar to TeamViewer, it allows access to the desktops remotely. So this is actually just an example of the software and how it looks. So when you download it and you get it up and running and you connect to the server, you can connect and have multiple connections listed. And then depending on which one you're wanting, you can just connect it. So actually, I have two connections that I pretty much am running almost constantly. One is to the electron microscope itself, and the other one is to an offline service where I can do my image processing and analysis. And currently at the moment, it is free. However, you are limited. So if you are wanting someone else to access the machine at the same time that you're accessing it remotely, you'll have to pay. So in the free version, only one person can access via the NoMachine to that particular server. And if you do, someone else tries to connect to it, you'll be booted off. And passwords can also be added to the connections, which adds another level of security. As well as to even get into the computers itself, you usually have to log in with the username and password for that computer. So it is downloadable, the program, you can download it to Windows, any macOS, any Apple, and onto a Linux system. And there's even a mobile application for Apple and Android. That's actually my mobile phone on the right there. And that's actually one of the one of the softwares on the Scanning Electron Microscope, and that's a project that was actually running at the time. There are some limitations with using the mobile application. It's really kind of awkward, and zooming in and zooming out is a little bit difficult, but you can zoom in enough normally to be able to see and track the progress of your experiment. However, doing anything else, unless you're going to be connecting your mobile phone or your iPad up to a keyboard or a mouse, is difficult just by hand. But it is. And also I was able to connect and be able to monitor an experiment from home as well by downloading it onto my own personal computer. So this is an example of how it looks when you're actually accessing the SEM via NoMachine. So just in reference, we have a Zeiss Gemini 450 here with SmartSEM and Atlas programs, because we do Atlas, the array tomography using Atlas here. So when you're just using just a standard smart SEM, so you're just doing simple SEM imaging, through No Machine, you're able to control the simple image settings, the ones that are easier that we normally would just control just by clicking. So things like turning the EHD off, turning on the accelerating voltage, adjusting the accelerating voltage, the current, the scan speed, anything that we can do that just requires us just to click or input a number or change a slight scale, that's easy enough to do via No Machine. And then for what we actually are primarily using No Machine for is, as I've mentioned, these like long experiments that we're doing that can run for days on end. I've had the SEM at one point running for 24/7 for nearly 2 weeks straight. And you don't want something to happen about 5 days into a 24/7 experiment, and then you realize, and you don't realize that, especially if something happens on Friday evenings or late in the evenings. If something happens at that point in time, but you don't know until 2 days later, and even 12 hours later, you've lost valuable imaging time. That actually did happen to me once, where I noticed that there was an error on the smart SEM, so I was able to come in and change it and restart the imaging. However, I still had to come in because, as I'll discuss in a little bit more, there are still some limitations in terms of the actual controlling of the microscope itself. So currently, this is just what we're primarily using it for, is for monitoring these long-term experiments. And through this other program, Atlas, we're able to partially control the microscope as well. However, you can just switch across to the other softwares in No Machine and access the microscope through the smart SEM, the main program really for the microscope control. So, however, also what you can do is, because this Atlas program is also part of the post-processing, so it does a lot with the stitching of the tiles for the images and the alignment of the images. And rather than me sitting at the SEM microscope as well, doing this step, and in a dark room with no windows, as I think anyone who works with electron microscopy can feel the pain of working with microscopes, I can actually do this while sitting in my office with nice windows and people that I can also talk to, and not feel like I'm in a prison in the SEM room. So this allows me to do some of the post-processing, not just with the remote control and monitoring of the microscope, but also some of the post-processing that needs to be done on these programs that are on the SEM microscope computer. So just a couple of notes for No Machine before I go into some of the more specific controls when it comes to controlling the microscope. So far at the moment, I can only work out that No Machine will only be able to access just the one screen. So if you have a setup with dual screens, you'll have to move so that if you say, for example, like we do have here, we have 2 programs that are required most of the time. I have to move the one program so that both pieces of software are shown on the same screen. I can then switch between the 2 programs easily enough. And as Rafa mentioned, our microscopes are not directly connected to an internet. So to actually be able to connect to the microscope and also the offline, a couple of our other computers, we have to use a VPN service. So it's also always good to double check if you're trying to access, especially if you're at home trying to access the microscopes, the amount of times you try to log in to a microscope and you wonder why it's not working and why it's not connecting. It could be that you're not connected to the VPN, as I've learned and had to read it a couple of times. So in terms of actually accessing a microscope for remote control, obviously we're going from this nice keyboard with all of these kind of buttons and dials and toggles to then a simple simple keyboard and mouse system. So it can be very difficult to go from something like this to just a normal setup. So currently at the moment, as I've mentioned, there are the easier controls when accessing the SEM. There are the simple click options where I can just click the beam on and off. I can just double click and type in a number and change the accelerating voltage, the current, And then when I'm actually doing the imaging, I can change the resolution, the dwell time. I can even do some brightness and contrast adjustments, as well as changing the detector being used in the scanning electron microscope. So this is just some simple, and then on the top, we've got, you can start and stop scanning. You can switch between views if you've got two detectors running at the same time, or if you have the camera as well. And then right at the end, we've got a couple of tools that can actually be used with the mouse wheel. And so currently in our system, we only have for the mouse wheel, the magnification and the focus. And then you can attempt to do some movements via the stage coordinates, which primarily would only be used for the Z in this sense, because we can do a lot of X and Y or translation movements by just double clicking at various points using maps and things like that. So in terms of X and Y, it's relatively easy to also move the stage in the microscope remotely. However, if you're wanting to do anything in Z up and down, then it gets a little bit more tricky. And also the delay, as Rafa mentioned, with internet connection and things like that, you don't want there to be a delay when you're moving the stage up and down in the SEM. So it is still a work in progress. As I've mentioned, there are some things that you are able to easily control via no machine or just remotely within the SmartSEM, mainly due to the SmartSEM software rather than the software being used to do the remote connection. However, there are some things that can be improved between trying kind of different mouse controls. I have found that the mouse wheel is often the best and the finest way to do changes. So I'm in the process of trying to change some of the settings that we can change with a mouse that aren't as easy to being with the mouse wheel. And I'll actually skip that one. And I'll actually show you some examples by hopefully accessing the SEM now, I think. Mm-hmm. So if I just drag it.
Yeah, it should be.
Okay. Okay. So if everyone can see, you can see no machine, and I have the SEM connected. So hopefully we'll connect.
VPN.
Oh yes, VPN. Thank you.
So we'll check that you're in Cisco.
Yeah. Again, as I mentioned, VPN. Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, yeah, I am. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is actually the SEM at the moment that I am now able to control somewhat. So this is actually a user that we have on this morning with their samples. I've asked them very nicely if I could just take over for 5 or so minutes during this talk. So you might not be able to see because the resolution does change. The screen resolution in no machine. So if you're wanting to do something that's quite small or fine, then you might run into some difficulties. So I'm going to try. So as you can see, there are some things you can just click on and off. So if I was to switch the EHT off, the accelerating voltage, I could just click. I can adjust the voltage by just double clicking. Let's see if I can go to, I can't see anything. Let me just. So. So now I'm actually trying to image, hopefully, if there's not too much of a delay.
It looks like
there's
a connection.
Yeah. So this is still one of the things that's a little bit why it's still a work in progress is that sometimes if the connection, and obviously we're trying to connect and we're on a meeting as well, so I feel sorry for the internet connection. But normally it works quite well as long as you're not overloading it and you're able to connect to the SEM. Quickly.
Yeah, it's scanning.
Yeah, it's scanning. It's very, very slow scanning. So, and let's see if I can just do a. There we go. So as I mentioned, there are some kind of shortcuts, so you are able to still do some movements even through no machine. So I can use various maps that are in the software and navigate throughout the sample quite easily by just doing a shift and a double click. And I can start and stop scanning. If I was to click on the magnification mouse wheel, I can come in and out of the magnification. And if I change the focus, I can adjust the focus as well. So this is just a kind of a brief example, because I don't have too much time to go into the full workings, but just so that it does work to remote access via no machine, and that you can do quite a bit with it. However, it will depend on your system that you have. And there are some limitations within the software, which is a work in progress. Let me just move back. And now